Dr. Stephanie Venn-Watson, I want to talk omega-3s. As people that are listening or watching, they've probably heard until they're blue in the face that omega-3s are good. We need omega-3s, but there's such thing as too much of a good thing. And I know this isn't meant to be an anti-omega-3 piece, but I'm very curious, like, what is the problem with omega-3s today?
Yeah, Thomas, great to be here. We're learning a lot about omega-3s, and it's been pretty recent. So everyone's kind of catching up on the science, right? So with regard to omega-3s, it's important to know that omega-3s, the type of fatty acid they're called polyunsaturated fatty acids, which your audience is probably well versed, or PUFAs. Polyunsaturated or unsaturated means a fatty acid that has double bonds in it. And every double bond is great because it's a hinge. So it allows that molecule to be able to bend and be flexible, which is great. But it's also a weak point where oxygen can come in and attack it. So when we talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids, that means it has multiple double bonds. And the more double bonds that a fatty acid has, the more flexible it is, which is why they're oils at room temperature. But it also means the more susceptible they are to oxidative damage. Oxygen coming in, and the fancy word for it is called lipid peroxidation. So that's where a lot of the risk is coming in a lot of the science.
Yeah. So what are we starting to see? Like, how does this manifest in someone because if you go to the store and you grab fish oil, and I've talked about this, ad nauseum on the channel, like there's really no way of telling. It's not like you can crack it open and it smells rancid, right? It's not like, you leave fish on the counter, yeah, you're going to smell when it goes rancid, but it's not the same with a fish oil. It's really, really hard to know how long something's been on a shelf, when it's rancid. Is there a way to know?
It's really hard. You can safely say that if it does smell like fish, that it's rancid. There are tests for it, but of course we're not going to go and send every bottle in, which is why a lot of studies have looked at fish oil. We did it ourselves. We went to the local grocery store, pulled 10 fish oils off the shelf, and submitted them, sent them in for testing, and over half of them had lipid peroxidation levels that were above international safety standards. So, and that is consistent with what other studies have shown. So it means that, it's not the producer's fault, right? It's just that polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3s, are just really susceptible molecules that it's very hard to not expose them to oxygen. And as soon as they get that exposure, they go bad. You're making a great point, not just, in our bodies, but in the bottle. And if they have gone bad in the bottle, we do know that when you take those, then they don't have the benefits that we've been able to, or that's been associated with omega-3s. So you're not really getting anything out of it. And some of the question is, could it be negative to our health to be taking these oxidized, omega-3s?
Yeah, because part of the benefit of taking omega-3s is to support our cell membrane. So
Right.
if it's oxidized, does it still incorporate into the cell membrane, or when it's oxidized, does the body just say, no, we need to combat this and get rid of it, neutralize it, do whatever we need to upregulate and get rid of it? Or does the body still say, oh, hey, it's, funky, dysfunctional omega-3, but we're still going to plug it in?
Yeah, I don't think we know quite yet how much our body uses it. We do know that it does get absorbed. We do know that our body tries to use it, but it just doesn't have the effect. So, for example, one of the benefits that has been shown with omega-3s is that it decreases oxidized LDL. So oxidized LDL cholesterol, we talk about having high LDL cholesterol is bad. We're learning a lot in that area where oxidized LDL cholesterol is much worse. So knowing that the omega-3s can't have that benefit, if they're oxidized, it kind of makes sense that, are we losing the benefits of omega-3s when they aren't at good quality?
A thing that I've often thought about, and we were talking about a little bit before we were recording, is like, it doesn't seem sustainable. And I'm a pro omega-3 guy. Like, I think omega-3s are good, but I try to get them from my diet. I don't take omega-3 supplements very often. But I do think about this. I'm like, okay, the state of the ocean, this is, I don't even think it's sustainable in my lifetime to be able to rely on like fish as a source of omega-3. And if I can't rely on fish as a source of omega-3, then how can I expect supplement companies that are wanting to cut corners as well to be sustainable. So I really think about this. I'm like, okay, well, what's going to happen? Because we've seen some literature suggesting that, a low omega-3 profile isn't good. But I would think that maybe our ancestors probably ate a lot more fish or relied on fish, whether it was even from lakes, rivers, and streams or the ocean. At some point, we probably had higher amounts of omega-3 in our diet than we do now. And maybe we're just coming into a new age where we have to accept that that's probably not the case anymore. What the heck's going to happen? What's going to happen to our cells?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things to unlock there. And the first is, we did get our omega-3s from fish and continue to. So if we got our omega-3s by eating fish versus from fish oil, chances are those omega-3s will still be in good quality. So you're getting the right quality of omega-3s when you're eating, and you're eating the whole fish. And so we're less likely to overfish from eating whole fish versus needing to take, literally tens of millions of tons of fish out of the ocean to squeeze them for the oil. So my guess is that where the science is heading, that omega-3 fish oils, NIH themselves have a summary webpage where they say that they've concluded, based upon all the science, that omega-3 fish oil supplements in general are not effective at decreasing heart disease and many of the other things, that the science has been around for, like you said, a long time. So as we understand that omega-3 fish oil supplements aren't doing the job because they're so susceptible to oxidation and eating fish can work, it's at least a beginning of a shift to let's stop taking the fish out of the ocean for oil.
Yeah.
Let's preserve it for a diet so that it provides a lot of nutrition. We get the proteins, we get the right omega-3s quality.
The food matrix in general. Whatever cofactors and whatever else might be supporting too.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other part of it is, I think we're going to find that, there's never really been a major nutritional deficiency syndrome of omega-3 and omega-6, right? So when we talk about essential fatty acids, the two that have long been known, they were discovered back-to-back by Mildred and George Burr back in 1920, and they were a husband-wife team. They discovered that omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid, omega-6 linoleic acid were essential. And the way that they discovered was that it was essential was that when mice didn't get enough of it, their tails got scaly. And so it was like, and they literally wrote the paper, new essential fatty acids discovered, and it's these because of rotten tails. And the rest kind of became history. So
rotten tail syndrome.
Rotten tail syndrome. So we're able to get omega, in general, we're often able to get the amount of omega-3s that we need through our diet because we don't see global omega-3 deficiency syndromes. At the most, it may be some dry skin, and there is evidence that there can be an impact on infants. But it's not like, scurvy and vitamin C with pirates or vitamin D and rickets, like during the industrialized revolution in London. Kids didn't get access to the sun because there was so much pollution. They got vitamin D deficiency, and you had, scores of children with bow-legged legs so it was just something very overt. And so I think what'll be interesting is I think it's going to evolve where omega-3s and omega-6s, we still need them, but they may not be as essential as we thought they were, and that we are able to get them through sources other than fish.
So if the main purpose that people, cardiometabolic, cardioprotective things aside, in the metabolic sphere, the main reason that people talk about omega-3s is cell integrity. What would be other ways that we can look at other fats that we can use to kind of support the cell integrity in that case?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we talk about so we're made of our cells, obviously. Yeah. So we're increasingly caring about cellular health. And the best ways to keep our cells healthy is to keep our cell membrane, right? That layer that's protecting the armor for our cells healthy. And so we know now that the quality of the fatty acids that make up our cell membrane dictate how healthy our cells are. So the more you have of polyunsaturated fatty acids, of the bendy fatty acids, the more flexible the cell is, but the more susceptible our cells are to lipid peroxidation and breakdown. the more we have of stable fatty acids, like we'll talk about C15 in our discovery that we had made from the dolphins, there is a separate group of fatty acids called odd-chain saturated fatty acids, especially C15, that help serve as bricks, and they help stabilize the cells, and they have no double bonds, so they're resistant to lipid peroxidation. So it's really about getting the balance between the two, and there's a whole new way that our cells are dying that was discovered by a group in Columbia University called Ferroptosis.
So what's this?
Was that a leading question or what?
I don't want to talk about it. So, yeah.
This is back in 2012. A group from Columbia University published this groundbreaking paper that barely got any recognition from like most of the world. However, since that paper was published, there have been over 10,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers on ferroptosis. To be honest, Thomas, I hadn't even heard about this 2 years ago. This is just getting really understood in translational, like practical non-science academic worlds. But ferroptosis is when we talk about how our cells die, there are like 3 primary ways that our cells die. This is a 4th. So it's a giant discovery, and specifically ferroptosis is when literally the fatty acids in our cell membranes are too fragile. That fragility leads to lipid peroxidation that combines with abnormal iron in our cells, which is a whole nother discussion. But when that free iron combines with lipid peroxidation, it results in massive reactive oxygen species, or ROS, being made, kills the mitochondria, and what's left is a fully intact cell, but dead, because all of its batteries are basically gone. So the world is like, what? And so it has a calling card that is very distinct. We've never, it hadn't been recognized before, 10, 12 years ago, and now is being seen as increased risk of type 2 diabetes, of heart disease, of all these metabolic abnormalities we're seeing, may in part be driven, or at least a component of, this new method of cell death. That's all goes back to the fragility and integrity of our cells.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So being able to, I know this is a completely separate discussion, but I'm curious if there's a 500-foot aerial view you can give on the iron kind of overload piece, only because I've talked about this kind of thing before, where I have gone out on a limb and kind of questioned that, we need to be adding more iron per se. I've talked about kind of not necessarily iron toxicity per se, but I'm like, okay, if you leave like a dumbbell out in the side, it's going to rust, it's going to oxidize. It seems like, and the difference between the ferric state and the ferrous state, and I know this is a little bit tangential, but can you give a little overview on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, it's not crazy at all. So interestingly, the whole iron story we had initially discovered in the dolphins. So we're working with the Navy dolphins and being able to understand how they age healthfully. We found that some dolphins get metabolic syndrome while others do not. And with that, we published in the same year that the Ferroptosis was published back in 2012, that dolphins were handling iron abnormally. We were seeing iron deposition in the liver, and that iron overload was then tied to fatty liver disease in dolphins. We're seeing the same thing in people, which is really interesting. So that got us going down the whole iron route, Thomas, and it's crazy, right? Yeah. Iron metabolism, so you can have where your cells become more fragile, red blood cells become more fragile. The liver says, ooh, let me take out those fragile red blood cells. When they pull those red blood cells, the corpses that leaves behind,
it's like a deposition of iron.
Yep. So then, just like you're saying about the dumbbells being left out in the rain, that iron is sitting in our liver. It then creates reaction around that iron, which includes ferroptosis, but inflammation, insulin resistance, all the things that come out from that. The iron then spills over into the blood and then starts seeding our brain and our different tissues, causing iron overload throughout the body. And so there are lots of studies now showing iron deposition in the brain, in the heart, right? It's just it's almost like nerve-wracking thinking about it.
Well, especially when a lot of times, and it frustrates me, and I don't want to go there, but when a lot of times the first line of defense is throwing an iron supplement in the mix, which I'm not a practitioner, so I'm very cautious about telling people to not do something, especially if someone says they're anemic. But I'm always just like, ooh.
It's
like,
tricksy,
more
right?
iron.
So there's this, and that's the whole thing is like, because the red blood cells are being pulled out of the system because they're weak, right? Because the because the cell membrane is fragile. When they get pulled out of the system, exactly like Thomas, like you're saying, people get measured, they have anemia and they're iron deficient in the blood, but all the iron's in the tissues.
Yep.
So it's like, so they're now like, when you go to the doctor, you can get tested for 4 different things. You can get tested for iron, which is obviously a good start, but you also get tested for ferritin, which actually measures how much iron you have in your tissues. So it can detect iron overload. And then there are a couple of other tests, total iron binding capacity, and I can't remember what the 4th is, but the 4th one, and when you look at all 4 of those, you could then basically understand the different results, and that can get your physician to like, okay, what do you really need?
Yeah.
So, it's gotten crazy complicated. There's a disease called dysmetabolic iron overload syndrome, or DIOS, which we understood this is what dolphins get. And now this is increasingly what people are getting too. So it is crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, it's especially, because if you, trying to fix it from a mineral perspective is like exhausting to think about. You're like, okay, well then you need copper, and well you need magnesium for this, and like, okay, this, copper facilitates this translate. It's like it's a mess. And
it's a mess
unless you really know what you're doing. And even then, I would argue like it's not getting to a root. It's not like it's just gonna happen again. And you mentioned something that I thought was fascinating about the sea lion. With the red blood cells, and you share that because you shared it with me, and I was like, no, save that for when we're recording.
So the Navy has a population of sea lions as well as dolphins, and
I understand the dolphins, but what does the Navy do with sea lions? I'm just curious.
Sure.
Before we start on
Same
that.
thing. So it's like how the Navy has dogs, and they help. So Navy sea lions are amazing. So they can help detect, or they can find underwater objects. So military does a lot of practicing, right? Practices dropping things from planes into the water, and the sea lions are actually able to go and retrieve. So instead of just continuing to drop stuff in the water and accumulating that, the sea lions go in and they go with a little catcher, and they attach the catcher to the to the fake object that was dropped in the water, and they're able to pull it up.
Cool. All right.
So they're retrievers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just random question. All right, good.
So one of these older sea lions has had chronic anemia. And so the Navy, because of the work we've done with understanding that C15 is a stable, saturated fat that is beneficial. In fact, the first essential fatty acid to be discovered since omega-3, which was over 90 years ago, they said, gosh, let's use the C15 supplement to see if we can help the sea lion. And they were able to show that the C15 supplement strengthened the sea lion's red blood cells so much that its red blood cells were stronger than all of its fellow cohorts.
That's good. So, I find that fascinating because that's more oxygen delivery. That's great.
Yeah.
But with what you were talking about previously, it's less of this potential iron deposition, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So when you talk about let's get to the core of the problem, again, the dolphins are giving us, wonderful clues that then are panning out and paying off in humans and dolphins. But what we found was that we then moved to a model of basically this whole combination of metabolic syndrome, fragile red blood cells, iron deposition, and we were able to show that pure C15 supplementation, it fixed all of it. So the red blood cells got more stable, so the anemia went away. There was no deposition of iron in the liver, the fatty liver disease and resulting fibrosis in the liver was gone. And then when we moved into the cellular side, we know that C15 repairs mitochondrial function and reduces reactive oxygen species. So it's working all the way from stabilizing the cell, so it doesn't get oxidized in the first place, to decreasing this iron deposition, which then it's so perfectly fit in fixing the problem that our leading hypothesis is that C15 nutritional deficiencies are actually the cause of ferroptosis. Like cells didn't die this way when we had enough C15 in our cells to keep them stable. So we've kind of done a whoops in taking C15 out of our diets, which is our primary source is from whole dairy fat. Population-wide, C15 levels have gone down. And then as a result, it appears that our cells are becoming more fragile.
So you were saying before, I mean, C15 might become the next like literal clinical deficiency.
Yeah.
Like we're actually that, and we're getting that close to like needing C15 in our diet so much that it's like, hey, this is actually like a real problem. This is not just saying, hey, like you could get by with, okay. I mean, and again, coming from, and I'm on a full disclaimer here, like you're not saying omega-3s are bad. Like omega, I mean, it's like you mentioned, it's a balance of these omega-3s and the C15. But no one is saying, hey, we're deficient in omega-3s, but we are seemingly deficient in C15.
Yeah, the evidence is getting much stronger for C15 deficiencies. And that's because, again, we're seeing diseases show up as we have taken C15 out of our diet. So it's been a 40-year experiment, right? Where it's like 1977 Congress, which is so crazy thinking that Congress came out with recommendations on what we should be eating. I mean, if you can imagine that today. But they did. They came out with a report and they said, too many people, too many men are dying from heart attacks, and they were. It was crazy, the prevalence of deaths from heart disease in the 1950s, going into the 1960s. And so that was associated with higher cholesterol. Higher cholesterol was then associated with saturated fats. Where do we get most of our saturated fats? Oh, milk and butter. So 1977 was really when the recommendations came out of, okay, stop eating whole fat milk and butter. And I remember my cereal milk changing from like wonderfully rich and white to blue and watery. So, and it's been that way, ever since. So yeah, it's been an interesting experiment. It hasn't gone well.
So with omega-3s being that their risk of oxidizing is so high, it potentially can be, I mean, at the least possibly a waste of money, depending on what you're getting. But so C15 doesn't oxidize as much. So that's something, or at all, right?
At all, yeah.
So, and with fatty 15, with your particular product, it's in a powder, so it doesn't oxidize anyway.
That's right, exactly. So C15, the way nature made it, is to be just this very sturdy 15-carbon fatty acid that has, again, no double bond. So it is completely resistant against oxidation. And that's its role. I mean, it appears that nature we have evolved to need C15 at very low levels, but just enough to basically enable our cells to fight off oxidation that's going to come from other fatty acids and just keep our cells young and healthy for as long as possible. It's an explanation of how humans and dolphins live longer than mice in the first place, is we have more stable fatty acids in our cells compared to shorter-lived species. It's kind of weird thinking that the thing we need to live, oxygen, is also the thing that inevitably takes us out. So how long can we fight against that?
So I didn't know that about rodents, that they're much more polyunsaturated fat just naturally. It's not necessarily a reflection of their diet. That's just kind of how their cells operate.
That is exactly right. And speaking to the cells, what's really encouraging is that we can influence the fatty acid content in our cell membranes readily. It's crazy how fast our cell membranes swap out the fatty acids that make them based upon what we eat. So there are studies showing that if you move from a polyunsaturated fatty acid diet to a saturated fat diet, which includes C15, within 2 to 5 days, our red blood cell membranes have now reflected higher C15 and lower polyunsaturated. So it's encouraging, because it means that we can, this whole problem with ferroptosis and cellular fragility, and as we get older, our cells get more fragile, it gives a lot of hope, because it's something that we could somewhat readily fix. Just make our cell membranes more stable by putting more C15 in it.
When you say membranes more stable, it's a tough question, because you want to have your membranes stable, yet when we look at omega-3s and we look at some of these other fats, like, okay, they increase membrane fluidity, which is, on the surface sounds like, no pun intended, like the opposite of stability, right? Like you want it fluid. Well, wouldn't fluid mean that it's kind of like super, almost, I don't know, dare I say, porous, or messages are able to kind of go in and out. So then what's the difference between rigidity and fluidity, and like, where do you want to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so we want both. And so our cells need to be both stable and resilient, and to be able to have flexibility. It's important to have both. As we get older, our cells become more fragile. They become more susceptible to lipid peroxidation, of attack by oxygen, to those double bonds. And so as we get older, there's a need to further basically stabilize our cells with, especially with C15, to then help fight against that increased susceptibility to oxidation. It doesn't seem like as we get older we have more PUFAs in our cell membrane. It's just for whatever reason, they're just more susceptible to that attack by oxygen.
Could also make sense, and this is purely theoretical, that we've been told for so long that saturated fats are problematic, that I know for a fact, at least people in my circle, that when they start getting to about 40, they start watching their intake of it. So this purely anecdotal, like, right, I can't say this is like anything other than it's kind of interesting when you play a dodgy game of connect the dots. You're like, well, shoot, like that's when people start kind of consciously or making a concerted effort to reduce it, because when they're younger, they think they're invincible. They don't care anyway. But then all of a sudden you start talking to people in their 40s. They're like, well, my doctor says I should watch my cholesterol, so I'm limiting my saturated fat. And, maybe they're doing it rightfully, maybe they're not. But the bottom line is, like, there's probably also that, because it's like when you look at some of the other nutrient deficiency stuff and you start looking at especially protein in older populations. So they think, okay, older populations need more protein than when they're younger because the rates of muscle protein synthesis go down. But then also in similar bodies of research, they'll say, well, it's also because older populations are eating significantly less protein. Why they are could be a million different reasons. Maybe they're told it's bad for their kidneys, whatever. Right. Bottom line is that's also the problem. So it's like, okay, maybe older populations are eating less, and by eating less, that's a bigger lever that they've pulled to decrease their chances of getting a minuscule amount of C15 in the first place. And then they're also on top of that being like, well, my doctor said don't eat the cheese, so I'm not eating the cheese. So then just by default, it's just getting a smaller and smaller amount.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And with the saturated fat story, just like with the polyunsaturated fatty story, the saturated fat story was partially right. Yeah, exactly. So we're learning now that there are two different types of saturated fats. There's even chain and odd chain saturated fatty acids. The odd chain are with odd numbers of carbons like C15, C17, even chains C16 and C18. So the science does seem to have gotten right as far as the higher the even chain saturated fats, the higher the risk of heart disease, of type 2 diabetes. It's also the saturated fats that are highest. They are much higher in dairy fat and our dairy fat products than C15. But to your point, is that as we've moved away from just I'm going to avoid those foods, we are taking down the bad fats, but we're also kicking out these good trace odd chain saturated fatty acids like C15. So it's like, how do we deal with that problem? And that's a big reason why we worked collaboratively with the Navy to develop Fatty 15. It's like, how can we provide just the C15 without these competitive C16 and C18 fats?
That's a good point, because if it was purely just a thing where you're saying, okay, we just need more saturated fat, you would have just been finding a way to give the dolphins some cheese or something.
Oh, and I would have been wonderfully out there participating in that experience. More butter, please. I would have loved for that to have been the solution.
Do you think we're getting to a point in the mainstream where people are starting to understand that, like, not all saturated fats are created equal? Because I feel like right now the guard is up so much. It's like you have these two polarizing sides. Yeah. And one wants to shout from the rooftops and says, like, no, unlimited saturated fat, I think it's, pro longevity. And then you have the other side that says, no, saturated fat's going to totally kill you. And it's not even a matter of finding, quote unquote, the right amount of saturated fat. It almost seems like the right type of saturated fat.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the science is heading. And I shouldn't even say heading, has strongly shown. And the issue is, like you're saying, that blinders have been up on saturated fats. Yeah. And so it's like you said, it's either black or white. And a big common question I get is, well, C15 has been known since the 1950s. How is it that, like, a dolphin veterinarian figures this out with the Navy team when you have this whole world of fatty acid experts like, come on, like, why wasn't this understood before? And so when we went to Ed Dennis, expert in fatty acids, with the hypothesis from originally from the dolphins, of it being higher levels of C15 being associated with healthier aging dolphins, Ed was like highly skeptical because we've known about C15, but the dolphin angle is interesting. So here are the studies you would need to do to kind of figure out if it's actually an active beneficial. So those are the 8 studies we did over 3 years, published those in scientific reports with Ed Dennis as the lead author, showing that C15 is not just beneficial and active, but this first essential fatty acid to be found, in 90 years. So it kind of took a dolphin, somebody coming in where we weren't looking to prove anything about which fatty acids were good and bad. It was just more of an open, blinded approach, really, of saying, hey, which fatty acids in dolphins, and really which molecules in dolphin predict the healthiest aging dolphins. We went even beyond fats, right? We were looking at amino acids and carbohydrates and all different types of molecules, like over 400 molecules, and C15, came out on top. So we kind of needed a kind of, I think, a fresher approach
For sure.
to fats.
Yeah, and that's why you guys came up with Fatty 15. And then I know the question that people are probably curious about is saying, okay, and we've talked about this before, but this is dolphins. Like, you are seeing this literature, this stuff, research coming out in humans as well.
Absolutely. And so that's where it got really interesting. So the dolphins gave us a hint, but at the same time, we were finding healthier dolphins had higher C15. Same thing was happening in the human literature, that showing that people who have higher C15 have a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, even specific types of cancer. And now we have lots of studies going from association, which is important. I will stand up for the epidemiological studies. They're really good for generating the right questions. Mm-hmm. But then multiple groups now showing that it actively causes the benefits with regard to, we know its mechanism of action. We know that it activates PPAR alpha, delta, and gamma. PPAR alpha and delta. We know that it activates AMPK and inhibits mTOR. We know that it works at the cellular level to strengthen our cells and repair mitochondria, and all of that ladders up to improved metabolic, heart, and liver health. So it's all come together thanks to not just us and the dolphins, which kickstarted it, but now it's really the world working on C15.
Can someone take too much C15?
We haven't seen evidence of too much C15. I think what happens is probably not unlike vitamin C, where when you have enough C15, your body just doesn't use it.
Yeah, it's essential, so it's not going to stockpile more in a given area.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also, we see this really interesting recurring U effect, in which things like mitochondrial dysfunction, it helps repair mitochondria, and it has a sweet spot in the middle, which is around this 20 micromolar level in our body. If you go higher, you lose the benefit. It doesn't hurt, but it's not like it just gets better. Yeah. So it really seems to be a sweet spot that our cells need. And wonderfully now there's a test for C15 that where people can, and where we think will be a definition of C15 nutritional deficiencies. So you'll know if you're below this is a C15 deficiency. If you're above it, then you have room to move up, but it's only just so much. So it's not like go take 10 times the amount of C15 we used to get.
Totally. So I mean, in the ideal situation, it would be utilize fatty 15, get C15, and then omega-3s as much as you can from the diet. I mean, being real here for people that don't have, can't eat fish. Because I mean, it's clear we see C15 is not a replacement for omega-3s. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. It's used in conjunction with. Do you have a recommended way people would get omega-3s, if they don't eat fish?
Yeah, I'll step carefully here. You're always really good at disclaimers too. So, not my area of expertise, but I do think there is a surprising amount of omega-3s that we can get from nuts and from, I'll stay away from the seed story, but, from nuts and other sources. What speaks to that, again, is that even though there are tests saying you have low or high omega-3s, there aren't really deficiency syndromes closely tied to those levels.
Yeah.
So again, I think we're getting to, it's very rare to say you have a deficiency, not based upon a test result, but based upon the presence of a clinical disease.
For sure.
Right? Yeah. That your doctor says, like rickets, like you have rickets, give me vitamin
Yeah, there's
D.
no like hard line. It's very difficult. And when there's not a clinical significance there, it makes it harder and harder to even like look, like what are you looking at?
Exactly.
Like what is the mechanism and how do we, like you could say, okay, it's cardioprotective, and we know maybe in the absence of, we see this, but it's not necessarily correlated directly with. Like it's, hey, if you don't have omega-3s, you're going to have a heart attack. And even then, that's so broad. It's, because you're coming to get down to, what particular ICD-10 code are you actually looking at here?
That's right.
Yeah. And then you get into a whole different ballgame of research funding and all that stuff.
Exactly. So that's where with the C15, it's getting really interesting really fast. We talk about fatty liver disease, which showed up out of nowhere, affecting now, 1 in 3 people globally, 1 in 10 children. And it just showed up. It was first detected by Mayo Clinic in 1980, where they reported 10 patients. And since then, now it's, 1 in 3 people globally. So it has really taken off, and data are continuing to support the hypothesis that fatty liver disease is a nutritional C15 deficiency syndrome. So vitamin C and scurvy, C15, fatty liver disease deficiencies. So again, it's kind of stepping up to the plate a lot faster than omega-3s did. And again, not saying that omega-3s aren't important. It's just that when we talk about essential fatty acids, C15 is emerging as possibly our essential fatty acid.
Well, where can everyone find Fatty 15, and where can everyone find you as well?
Yeah, sure. So fatty15.com is where you can read our whole story. We have a little TED Talk on the whole dolphin discovery, and learn about the supplement, and then all the science behind C15, all the peer-reviewed publications done, not just by us, but many, many others, are at discoverc15.com.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, it's wonderful being here, Thomas.